Service continues with a reading from the book of Psalms. Mizmor LeDavid. Adonai mi yagur be'ohalecha, mishkon behar kodshecha. Holech tamim ufoel tzedek, v'dover emet bilvavo. Lo ragal al lishono, lo asa l're'ehu ra'ah. V'cherpa lo nasa al krovo. Nivze be'einav nimas v'et yirei Adonai yechaved. Nishbal hara v'lo yamir. Kaspo lo natan b'neshech, v'shochad al naki lo lakach. Ose ele lo yimot le'olam. O Lord, who shall dwell in your sanctuary? Who shall abide upon your holy mountain? He who lived with integrity, did what was right, and spoke the truth in his heart, who had no slander upon his tongue, who did no evil to his fellow, who did not reproach his neighbor. In his eyes a vile person is despised, but he honors those who revere the Lord. He takes an oath even to his own harm and does not change. He does not take advantage of the poor, nor does he take a bribe against the innocent. Whoever does these things shall stand firm forever. And from the writings of Ben Sira, the wisdom literature, reflections on life and when life comes to an end. Fear not death, we are destined to die. We share it with all who ever lived, with all who ever will be. Bewail the dead, hide not your grief, do not restrain your mourning. But remember that continuing sorrow is worse than death. When the dead are at rest, let their memory rest and be consoled when the soul departs. Death is better than a life of pain, and eternal rest than constant sickness. Seek not to understand what is too difficult for you. Search not for what is hidden from you. Be not overoccupied with what is beyond you, for you have been shown more than you can understand. As a drop of water in the sea, as a grain of sand on the shore, are our few days in eternity. The good things in life last for limited days, but a good name endures forever. O God, our heavenly parent, you redeem our souls from the grave. You are the rock of our salvation. Forsake us not in time of trouble, in days of distress and desolation. Help us to endure, O Lord, for we have placed our hope in you. We'll join together now in the 23rd Psalm. If you know the words, please join with me. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil. My cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I shall dwell in the house of the Lord forever. This morning there are a number of members of the family and friends who will be speaking. And so at this time, I'd like to call upon Sarah and John.
Where do you want to sit? You want to sit? Welcome, everybody. My name is John Siegel. I am one of Leon's son-in-laws, one married to Sarah, or as Leon called her, Tookie. Tookie is the older of Leon's identical twin daughters, the other being Catherine, or Katie, or as Leon called her, Katrinky. And they are identical. One of Leon's favorite stories was when it was his turn to feed them as infants. First he fed one, and then the other. Except they look so much alike, the other one was actually the same one. Tookie and Katrinky's younger brother is Arthur, also known as Ari, or as Leon dubbed him, Young Kipu. I think you may already get a flavor of Leon's personality from these affectionate names. Leon mostly called me John or son-in-law, but in recent years took extreme delight in introducing me as son-in-law who retired before me. I love this brilliant, multilingual, loving, generous, courageous, deep, and complex man. In summer 2020, family, we recorded, Sarah and I recorded Sarah interviewing Leon for 7 hours of his amazing oral history. Sarah did a beautiful job, which will be a family treasure for years, and Leon really seemed to look forward to and enjoy it. Today I want to share a broad overview of his life, in great part gleaned from these sessions, plus a special focus on his childhood in Poland, both because it's fascinating and because I think, at least to me, it helps understand a big part of his entire story. So first join me in a chronological and geographical journey of Leon's life from Poland to Cleveland. Leon was born, I don't know how to necessarily pronounce it, Elozor, E-L-O-Z-O-R, Gabinet, but he was called by his Hebrew name, Eliezer, in 1927 in a small town in north-central Poland. When he was only 4 weeks old, his father, Chaim, unsuccessful in his dream efforts to get a visa to Palestine, instead got a visa to come to the United States and went to Chicago where there was some other family, where he spent the next 7 years saving to bring over his wife named Sarah, Leon, and Leon's half-sister Marion. At about age 4, Leon and his mother and sister moved to a small town called Krinky, near the border of what's now Belarus, where they lived until joining Chaim in Chicago in the summer of 1934. And Leon remembered an amazing amount of details of his life in Krinky, and that'll be the source of a little vignette I will return to shortly. So as the family was reunited in Chicago, an aunt who lived there, upon learning his name, said, no, now you are now Leon. And so he became Leon. Leon's life in Chicago, I better put my glasses on, involved attending a series of public schools and Zionist Hebrew schools. He further immersed himself in Zionism by joining the youth group Hashomer Hatzair, I know what I just, which was the source of his close childhood friends, all of whom continued calling him Eliezer. And of course, he played hockey. Leon enlisted in the Navy shortly after high school graduation in 1944, serving until August 1946. He told us he enlisted because he wanted to fight the Nazis and because he recognized and saw it as a way to get the higher education he craved through the GI Bill. Well, instead of Europe, his naval experience was in the Pacific theater, including surviving a Japanese kamikaze attack which severely damaged his cruiser. This was during the Battle of Okinawa in spring 1945, to the cost of the lives of approximately 250 of his fellow sailors, many killed from strafing while he and his shipmates waited for hours in lifeboats for rescue. Leon rescued the life of one of his fellow sailors who was severely injured by pulling him out of a turret so he could get into the lifeboat. After discharge from the Navy, Leon used the next 5 months or so to plan his journey with a number of his fellow friends, Chicago friends, to Palestine, where he spent several months in 1947 before returning to Chicago. He also had another significant preliminary venture involving Palestine before joining his friends, And about Palestine, you will hear from Sarah. So no more spoiler alert. The next years in Chicago provided, after he had returned, provided the significant developments of meeting and courting his beloved Lael, whom he married in December 1948, and with the GI Bill help completing college, a stint in medical school, and then law school, all at the University of Chicago. So in summer of 1953, law graduate Leon and his pregnant wife left the familiar surroundings of Chicago and ventured west to Oregon, where he was first a law clerk to an Oregon Supreme Court judge, then worked at the State Tax Commission for 2 years, and he then moved the family to Portland, where he worked in a prominent law firm as their first Jewish hire. And in Portland, Ari arrived on the scene. So let's fast forward to 1968. After doing some adjunct teaching in Portland, Leon got the big-time itch to leave the law firm and become a law professor, choosing Case Western Reserve over the competing offer from the University of Arkansas, thus, as he often pointed out, denying the Clintons a valued future colleague. And for the next 53 years, he was a beloved law professor at Case, focusing mostly on tax and tax-related courses, as well as briefly serving as acting dean. Indeed, he started this very fall 2021 semester teaching tax until, sadly, the fast-growing brain tumors that took his life overcame the strong desire in his brain and heart to complete his teaching career. And in these 53 years, he truly adopted Cleveland as his home. Some of my favorite memories are attending or watching Browns games with him, sometimes, if I can still call them Indians games. And he was thankfully not one of those Chicago people who couldn't let go of the Bears or Cubs. Of course, the most important parts of his life in Cleveland and Oregon before that were his family, secondarily his friends, most recently his Louise, as you will hear from others today. I won't get in on that. But let's go back to Krinky, Poland, circa 1930. Leon and his mother and sister moved to Krinky at about age 4 to live with his wife's parents in a house with a central stove for heating and no indoor plumbing. Oral history. Dad, did you have a house, an outhouse? You're darn right we had an outhouse. And his memory is unbelievable. The family had a cow named Rosa, from which he directly drank unpasteurized milk, and a goat named Siegel, from which his grandmother milked to make cheese. His grandfather was the town rabbi, Orthodox, and in fact, Leon described the home as being as traditionally Jewish as could be. But there was another aspect to his young life, a secular Zionist aspect. Leon's grandfather started him in a traditional cheder at age 4, where he and his friends sat on a long bench reading and reciting Hebrew without understanding it, and the family spoke Yiddish in the home. Well, one day at cheder, Leon and his buddies were monkeying around, as he put it, and when Leon couldn't read in his turn because he had lost his place, the rabbi slapped his face. When he told the story at home that night, his mother's brother, Yosel, said, "That's it, you're done with that school," and enrolled him in a progressive Tarbut school run by the Zionist organization, where Yosel taught, and where Leon studied in both Polish and Hebrew and learned to understand and speak Hebrew. And he learned to speak a lot of other languages, too, over the years. So Leon, as a young child, experienced the dynamic tension between tradition and modernity. Despite living in the traditional Yiddish-speaking Jewish home of the town Orthodox rabbi, he was allowed to follow his uncle, Yosel, a great influence on him, who was, as Leon said, as secular as you could be, into part of that modern secular world. He also had 2 cousins who were key role models, the younger of whom, also named Eliezer named for the same relative. Eliezer moved to Palestine when Leon was about 5 and instantly became Leon's pioneer hero. So experience a home life with a traditional Jewish practice, coupled with his modernist Zionist education and influence of his uncle and cousins. I see this as guiding Leon throughout his life, finding a place both in his mind and heart. And he saw no conflict, and it helped later on that both of his parents were both Orthodox and Zionists who supported his life decisions. His love for Jewish liturgy, Traditions, music remained deeply ingrained to the end, but he also loved and lived in a broad world of intellectual curiosity and pursuits and was very much a Renaissance man. He embraced it all simultaneously, tradition and modernity, and that to me was a vital part of what made him such an incredible person, starting from his youth. I want to end with a brief note about music. I will cherish many, but particularly two memories of Leon in music. One is our family trip to Israel in 2011. Sarah and me and Ira and Katie and Leon. And Leon was sitting in the front seat as we drove with our guide and who has become our special beloved friend, Ido. Ido, if you're watching in Israel, we miss you. When the two of them, Ido and Leon, began singing one after another Hebrew song with, mostly Ido, but with arms flailing. The songs Ido learned as a Sabra youth and Leon as a Chicago student and youth activist were the same, and the joyful singing was a revelation. Finally, when Leon frequently came to our home for dinner, he invariably entered and continued through much of the visit, humming or singing any of a multitude of songs. Of course, many Jewish songs, show tunes, humming classical melodies and standards. But I do mean any song, including on more than one occasion, Onward Christian Soldiers or Christmas carols. It's true. If a tune popped into his head, out it popped from his mouth. These and so many more memories I will cherish. When our family now gathers for a meal, we no longer have the person to say, "Eat that, it will put hair on your chest." But we will always have them in our hearts. God bless you, Leon.
I hope I can get through this. And I do have to put on my glasses. As John said, nicknames were, I guess I can take this off, were big in my family. I was Tookie, yes, you all know. Now it's out in the open. But to me, my father was always Daddy-O or Papa-san. Papa-san was a complicated man. It's not a bad thing. But I never really knew him, knew what made my dad who he was, until he was in his 80s and even his 90s. To most of my friends, my dad's friends, his students, his colleagues, he was a brilliant lawyer and an amazing professor. He had a sharp wit. He loved to tell, and then he would laugh at his own jokes. He was a storyteller, which might be why he was such a great lawyer and teacher. Many of his classroom lectures, if you were one of his students, you would remember he would detail the exploits of Leon Gabinet, boy lawyer. And I do know that he used to pepper his exams with the names of professional hockey players, but he would invert the first letters of their names, so it was a little bit subtle. And you really had to know some hockey to understand why he was putting these characters into his exam questions. But my dad was also a very quiet and private man at times, a serious man. Don't come home from college with a pierced ear, Ari. It was not a wise decision on my brother's part. But I think my brother probably had the last laugh, because I know that his then girlfriend, now wife, Chrissy, would tell my brother, "Hey, you're going home. Take the pierced earring out of your ears so your dad doesn't see it." That's a true confession, Dad. Oh, well. And do not get serious with the wrong boy, or you will definitely feel the disapproval. That was me. I said to my sister, I'm not sure whether she ever felt my dad's wrath, but she told me she was too well behaved. I think that's actually true. Part of this was my dad's absolute and fierce, fierce love of his family, and then his grandchildren and his 5 great-grandchildren. I can't tell you how much pride I could see in him that this was his legacy. My dad knew when every airplane landed. And in the cell phone age, it became a running joke that the phone would ring before we had even gotten off the plane, and it was my dad saying, "I know you landed." We decided and I think we were right, that he believed that it was his worrying alone that kept every plane we were on in the air. It got to be so that I would say to him, "Dad, make sure that the plane stays in the air." That deep and fierce love showed in his devotion to our mom for the 56 years of their marriage, through her terrible health challenges and her early death when my dad was only 77. And that seems very young these days. We always knew that my dad was raised in a religious home and loved Israel. And as we grew up, my dad sometimes mentioned this kibbutz Sasa. But I didn't know and really didn't pay much attention to what this kibbutz was all about. Then when Dad was in his 80s, we took a trip to Israel, as John mentioned, and it was John and me and my sister and brother-in-law, Ira, and our intrepid guide, Ido. The other piece that was a mystery to me was that when I became a lawyer, I would meet many others who had been my dad's former students. And often they would say, "What's the real story? Was your dad a gun runner?" I was, "What are you talking about?" Fast forward to 2011, when we took this trip to Israel. My dad was just shy of his 84th birthday. And once there, Dad said that he wanted to find his old friends at Kibbutz Sasa. Okay, so he had friends at Kibbutz Sasa. John and I and Ido drove to Kibbutz Sasa way up near the Lebanese border on a very cool Shabbos afternoon. And we just started wandering down the road of the kibbutz and happened upon some people, and we said, "Do you know where so-and-so lives?" And they said, "Oh, yes, down here." We just knocked on the door of a family that lived at the kibbutz, the Mateks. This couple had been my father's friends in Chicago when they were teenagers, and they had been fellow members of the Zionist group that John mentioned, Hashomer Hatzair. They invited us in. They were amazed to see my dad. They had last seen him in the 60s when he and my mom had visited. And in their beautiful home on the kibbutz, I learned for the first time that my father had made Aliyah. He had emigrated to what was not even Israel at the time. It was then British Mandate Palestine. I had no idea about this. He was what they call a halutznik, a pioneer, and he worked in an apple orchard on the kibbutz. I can't tell you how stunned I was and how this became just a pivotal point in my life to realize I didn't know my father. But as I said, my dad was a quiet and he was also a private man. So what I also learned about my father is that he didn't talk about this time of his life because of his sadness and his shame that he had ultimately left the kibbutz, left his friends, left the mission of forming the state of Israel to return to the United States. His reasons were very legitimate. He wanted an education. They wanted him to be an apple farmer. And I have to say, when we went to the Matek's home, I think my dad's decision obviously was a good one because this is his legacy of coming back to the States. But on the wall was a huge photograph of Mr. Matek, our host, riding a horse. He became a cattle rancher in Israel, from the city of Chicago to becoming a cattle rancher in Israel. He came back to the United States shortly after he met my mom, and the rest is our history. That leads me to the answer to the other question. Was my dad a gun runner? We didn't really learn the answer until the summer of 2020 when my dad was in his 90s. And when COVID hit, and as John said, we did an oral history. And I interviewed my dad for hours and hours after dinner each week. Actually, Jordan, who's here today, had spilled a little bit of the beans to John. And he said something about my dad being imprisoned on Cyprus. Okay, again, what? We thought, this is ridiculous. This can't really be true. But as we did the interview, my dad opened up about his efforts to help the Haganah bring weapons from the United States to then Palestine, and also to bring Holocaust survivors from around Europe to Israel or Palestine. This was a challenge because obviously the state of Israel had not been formed, little history here, and the land was controlled by the British. And my dad was pegged because he was a brave guy, but also he was fluent in many of the languages that the Holocaust survivors spoke, whether it be Yiddish or German or Polish, and so he was invaluable. Twice my dad sailed from then Palestine to the United States and literally escorted disassembled weapons back to then Palestine. On the way, he would stop in France. They would pick up Holocaust survivors to bring them to the land of Israel as well. He made it twice, back and forth. The third time, not so lucky. And he was, obviously the ship was stopped, and he ended up in an internment camp on Cyprus. Now, he wasn't imprisoned in a horrible prison, and he only spent 2 weeks there, but this was another piece of my father that I had no idea about. So now to all the students, former students out there who asked me over and over, was your dad a gun runner? The answer is yes. I always thought that my father had neither admitted or denied the story because he liked the mystique of, is Professor Gabinet, did he run guns? No, he was in fact a gun runner. I do want to say a few words about family as well. My father had not just one family, but several. Obviously, he had his nuclear family. He had his Shul family, which I can't tell you how important his Shul family was to him over the years. And of course, he had his law school family. In recent years, he also had his family of Louise. Now she has a nickname too, of course. But my dad told me once, she's my life partner. Louise brought my dad happiness in the last years of his life. But I have to say it was weird when he would call and tell me that he wouldn't be home for the night. Sorry, Louise. But my sister would try to find my father calling long distance. He wouldn't answer. She would call me, where's Dad? Where's Dad? Is he okay? Katie, he's at Louise's. He's okay. We know in my family what Louise did for my dad in the last weeks and days and moments of his life. It is beyond words. Until he couldn't speak anymore, he wanted to know where Louise was and whether he could have a kiss from her. The hospice nurses got to know and really respect Louise for her devotion to Dad. And speaking of the hospice nurses, I can't talk about this last period of Dad's life without expressing the gratitude of my family and the deep appreciation for their care. They told us on more than one occasion that he was their favorite patient. Dad is gone, but he leaves a lot in all of us, in our love of family, crossword puzzles, books, a good joke, Israel, and ice hockey. I think ice hockey is a gene, actually, in the Gabinet family because his children, his grandchildren, and now his oldest two grandchildren, both a boy and a girl, are playing hockey. But I don't want to leave on a sad note, so I'm going to read what a former student shared with me when he learned of Dad's death. And I was told that I can attribute this to Michael Saltzman, so I will. He wrote, Sarah, just in case I never told you this story about your father, here it goes. I took state taxation from none other than Professor Leon Gabinet. Each student's assignment was to compare one state's laws to that of Ohio's. I was randomly assigned the state of Wisconsin. I entitled my paper on Wisconsin. Your father wrote above my grade, Michael, your title was better than the content. May his memory be a blessing. That was Leon. Leon's legacy carries on. I asked my sister to read my remarks, and at the top of the page it said, Sarah's Remembrances Draft 2. My sister edited the remarks, handed the pages back to me, and at the top was a grade. She gave me a pretty good grade. And the comment, content was better than the title. I hope so. I think we're supposed to.
I know, but
I think we're supposed to do this. I think Henry. Isn't Henry next?
yeah.
And now we'll call on dear friend Dr. Henry Bloom.
So, okay. Should I take my mask? Can people hear me? Take it off. Leon often cited his favorite philosopher, Clint Eastwood, to say that a man should know his limitations. And this is beyond my limitations, but I will try. Leon came into our life when he brought Bethel to join with a part of Beth Am to create our traditional egalitarian participatory shul. When I say he brought the old Bethel to create our new Bethel, I mean that he not only carried the Sifrei Torah, but he worked with Karen Kugelman to set up the legal framework, and he personally managed the sale of the old Bethel assets and brought a chunk of money. And when we got our own building, and it was decided that we needed a Shabbos-compliant elevator, it was Leon who schnorred the money for an elevator that has caused recurrent problems since, including trapping Leon a few months ago. And when, as our beloved Rabbi Moshe Adler, Zichrono Lebracha, was getting older and his already soft voice was waning more and his mumbling became worse, it was decided that we must have a Shabbos-compliant PA system. To whom did they turn for the schnoring but Leon? So that, as Leon predicted, everyone would be able to hear Moshe mumbling in stereo. At the start, Leon and Moshe coached a bunch of us in doing an aliyah, which at that point I hadn't done for 40 years. He was so encouraging, humorous, accepting, inspiring without trying to be. Later, he helped me to learn to lead my first service, Musaf, but after listening to me daven, of course, he had to teach me a Hebrew round just so we could sing together. He loved singing in that untrained yet booming, clear, true-pitched bass baritone. He would hear a new tune that someone brought for a prayer, and he would turn and say, "That is a Russian," or Ukrainian, or Polish, or Yiddish, or French, or German. He commanded 9 languages at least, drinking, or army, or folk song. Then sometimes in the middle of the service, but certainly afterward, would sing 6 or 8 or 10 verses of it from memory. I would sing wordless harmony, but even when it was a song I used to perform, I usually couldn't remember some or any of the verses. It was our great pleasure to become the Bethel Boys Choir, as he named it, first with Rabbi Moshe singing tenor at Kiddush, later at the back of the shul with Michael Bloom, Juliana Sadok, Savina, or other passing musicians. Then there were the off-color jokes, but enough of that. I won't be Gabinet way with Leon anymore, so his oft-repeated threat that God would punish me someday for making puns will have come true. Especially after the death of his beloved Leo, he really became for us a part of our family. For Meir, a cherished uncle, for me, maybe the admired and loved older brother that I wish to have had. Others can tell of his illustrious career in the law, academia, and teaching, and it was illustrious. We both encountered former students who admired and cherished him. Meir, a psychologist, once had a law school student patient who started talking about this old professor who seemed livelier and better than the younger faculty, and taught with such clarity, humor, and verve, referencing hockey, his other religion, often. She didn't have to do a lot of guessing. Several things about Leon made him special. First, his genuineness as a man from a simple background. If you called him sir, he reminded you that he was an enlisted man. When we wanted to take him to a fancy restaurant for his birthday, his choices were his favorites. The Tavern on Lee, where he could get a good burger, or Jack's, where he could get a good corned beef sandwich. Though he became a hockey buddy with his student, Coley Burks, who was a New York City real estate multimillionaire, when asked by that man's friends where he prepped, he proudly answered Crane Technical High School, a Chicago public school, and thought that the question was hilarious. Of course, Leon was later sent by the president of CWRU to hit that man up, and was so proud of his schnorring that brought $10 million or so to fund the Environmental Law Institute. He was pleased that it almost brought him into the league of Chrissy, his daughter-in-law, the president of Brown, of whom he was so proud. But he said his time as dean of the law school was the worst of his life. Though he was proud of his World War II U.S. service, he didn't tell us, I don't think, for if he did, it was so quiet, or if he did, it was so quietly we nearly missed it, about his having his ship shot out from under him in the Pacific. Nor that after the war he bought guns from the corrupt Chicago police and smuggled them into the state that was to become Israel, endangering his future and probably his life, and eventually being arrested by the Brits and interned on Cyprus. When we asked him how the British guards treated him, he said that they got along fine, because the guards were all young Scots, and would say, adopting a perfect Scottish accent, "We hate the fucking Brits just as much as you do." He could get along with just about anyone, and used to joke about his shipmate, a redneck from Arkansas, who had never seen a Jew before and was sure that all Jews had horns and tails, and would say, in perfect twang, "Leon, you ain't no damn Jew, Leon, are you?" And Leon would say, "Yes, I am," and they would get along. He had a wide circle of dear friends, from the law school faculty to his lunch club to Portland to Israel and his old kibbutz chaverim. But he was saddened in recent years that many had passed away. No matter where he was, he remained true to himself, to his beliefs, and to his loves. First was his love for his family, for Lael, for each of his kids, Sarah, Katie, Ari, and their spouses, John, Ira, and Chrissy. For his beloved grandchildren, maybe talking most of his grandson who is becoming a surgeon, since Leon himself dropped out of medical school after 2 years, because he didn't like blood. But he remembered everything he learned there, and liked to astound me with an instant and usually accurate diagnosis. And such a gleam in his eye when he'd speak of his great-grandchildren, how he loved that they call him Saba Rabba, and loved to see them learning Hebrew. After he mourned Lael for several years, he found love with a couple of other companions, but at least to our eyes, nothing as passionate as with Louise. They were quite a pair, neither able to hear very well. Can you hear that, Louise? Yet understanding each other's meanings perfectly well. They shared a love of literature and language, a joie de vivre, and a congenital optimism. Next, he loved the Jewish tradition, having started school in a Polish cheder, though transferring to a Tarbut school where secular subjects were taught before emigrating to the U.S. He taught Hebrew school as a young man, and he kept Bethel going through years of adversity and founded our shul, writing in our bylaws that it had to maintain a traditional service as performed at the original Bethel. But he wanted women to be an equal part, and with Jamie Sant was part of one of the first bat mitzvah ceremonies, certainly in an Orthodox shul ever. His love and belief in the existence and perpetuation of the Jewish people was foundational. Beyond our shul, he worked to maintain the Jewish community, ironically becoming a patient in rehab at the Wilds, which he was instrumental in starting and which was named for a Bethel family. Crucial to Leon was the existence and perpetuation of Eretz Yisrael, the fulfillment of the Zionist dream, which he wanted to be a refuge, a beacon for the Jewish people, and for the world, a land of justice, of equality, of peace, but ever ready to defend itself. Leon recently told us that he wanted on his tombstone, Tzionim Me'orav, Moreh, Av, Saba, Saba Rabba, involved Zionist, teacher, father, grandfather, great-grandfather. Though that is a pretty good summary, I would dare to add that he was as much of a mensch as I've ever met. I know that Mayor agrees. There will be a big hole at our Shabbos table, in our life, in our shul, without him. I can only hope that we, all of us, will keep his memory and legacy alive as long as we live. Zichrono lebracha.
Now we'll call on two of Leon's grandchildren, Josh and Gavi.
So for as long as I can remember, my Zadie was this towering, larger-than-life figure to us, both figuratively and literally. In fact, this morning I was asking how tall he was because I had this vision in my memory that he was 6'3", 6'4". He was that. I guess I just remembered him being that way. I was informed that he was less than 6 feet this morning, but he had this this booming, deep voice, his big hands. He would give you these gentle, grizzly bear hugs. And he was just an amazing, loving grandfather to all of us grandkids, myself, Gabby, Nate, Nick, and Ben. And, these last couple of months gave me a chance to reflect on all these memories from him and that have stuck with me over the years. And you've heard tons of stories here, but I'll just maybe speak to a couple of the themes that really jumped out to me and that, I know I'll cherish here. First was his voice and his singing. You guys have heard a lot about that today. He just had this beautiful, deep voice that was so distinct. And, some of my earliest memories of him are we would, go to visit my grandparents on Wicklow Road. And I would sleep in my grandmother's loom room, and he would come in, and you'd get probably not what was traditionally sang to little kids. I would get a bunch of Polish lullabies, 100 bottles of beer on the wall, the roaches and the bedbugs, a song that had the lyrics, come smoke a Coca-Cola, drink Camel cigarettes. That's the kind of guy that he was. And, my wife Danielle and I still sing those songs to our kids every night. They all know that, it's a strange song. But that wasn't the only side to his singing. He had a love of Jewish prayer and Hebrew songs, and that just stuck with me. Sitting, whether it was in synagogue in Montreal when he came to visit us or in shul here, he just had this amazing, he could cut through all of the other voices, singing the prayers, reading the Torah. As recently as July, I got to go to, the Bloom's house, and we sat, and he sang Torah and sang all the prayers and got me to do it too with him, and it was just an unbelievable experience, and it was so, that just sticks out to me, that singing voice of his. He was one of the most well-read, intelligent, cultured people you will ever meet, as I'm sure many of you know. When we were little, I have this memory of him taking, I'm pretty sure you were there, they tried to take us to the symphony when we were 7 or 8 to give us some culture. And you knew it was going downhill when I bought maybe he was happy. I brought a book about the Boston Bruins and promptly fell asleep in the first 5 minutes. And he never let me live it down, but he was always trying to share culture with us. He was such a passionate learner. A few years ago, I remember he was editing his book. I mean, the man's in his late 80s editing his tax law book, and we're discussing the intricacies of the impact of gay marriage on tax law. And this is a guy who's almost 90, and just unbelievably intelligent and inspiring. He had a great sense of humor. As you heard, John kind of said what I was going to say here, which is I remember, and I guess I took it very literally, that whenever he wanted me to eat or do, I would, put hair on my chest, which worked. Apparently it worked for Ari too. Maybe we took it too seriously. But he was never shy of throwing out a zinger or two, so when I grew my hair shoulder length, he was not shy to share what he thought about that. I too had to hide a pierced ear from him. Forever, and this one, I don't know why this one sticks with me. One of my first girlfriends was named Shoshana, and didn't matter who I was dating, forever, I would call him up on Sunday nights and he'd say, "Hey Josho, how is Shoshana?" I'd say, "Zadie, that's not my girlfriend's name." He finally, when I introduced him to Danielle, my wife, he finally realized I think the joke had maybe run its course. Here, I'll share one other joke that I heard. I was listening to this oral history this morning, and I guess he'd asked his grandmother why he had to wear a kippah every day, and his grandmother shared with him that because God would hit your head with a hammer if you didn't. To which he responded, and that's when I became an atheist, which clearly he didn't. That was his sense of humor. He was a family man and loved his great-grandchildren. So, Samson, Lily, Emmett, Logan, now Nora. I mean, for me, I just loved watching him and share those same experiences that I had with him with the great-grandkids. I mean, he would put them on his lap, he would sing songs to them and read with them and give them these giant, enveloping hugs. And, it just really, their Saba Rabba meant so much to them, and I know that he brought so much joy. They brought so much joy to his life. More than anything, and I think that I've said this many times to my kids or whoever will ask me about him over the last few weeks, I kind of, it's how do you not celebrate a life like this? I mean, the man did it his way until he was 94. He was teaching not a few months ago. An amazing girlfriend, loving girlfriend, novel clubs, reading plays, theater, having lunch with friends. I mean, it's just how many people get to say that? And I think, if we can do half as much as he did, we'd be really lucky. We'll miss him really dearly.
So I apologize in advance if you've heard some of these stories, but there are a lot of overlapping themes. And as Sarah pointed out to me yesterday, I'm apparently the closer, so no pressure, but that feels about right because my Zadie was a lot to live up to. So I will give it my best shot. So my nickname was Gabaduli, and there's only one person in the world who called me that, and probably only one person I would allow call me that. But the other moniker that he gave me was the one that I held most dear, which was one and only granddaughter. And it was a one word, and whenever he called, he would say, "Hello, my one and only granddaughter." And whenever I called him, I would say, "Hi, my Zadie, it's your one and only granddaughter." Something I carried with such pride. He actually had many names over the years. My father's parents were Bubby and Zadie growing up, so he was Grandma Zadie, one word. So as in, have you talked to Grandma and Grandma Zadie before? Or when Lael passed, my grandma passed, he became Cleveland Zadie, one word. And now he's Saba Rabba, which is what my kids and Josh's kids and now Nora call him. He was, as Josh said, an outsized figure in our lives. The brain, the sheer intellectual horsepower, the cultural facility, and the pressure to go to grad school, which thankfully we eventually lived up to, although not to law school, and I think that will always be a sore point, but sorry. You had enough lawyers in the family already. He was literally an outsized figure, as Josh said. He just was so big in our minds as kids, and I remember so clearly, even as an adult, there's nothing like a Zadie bear hug. He would envelop you in his arms, his giant hands holding your kepi, as he called it. And in that place, I felt like an asteroid could be barreling towards us and we would be safe. I never wanted to let go. There was also the notorious Gabinet finger, which you got if you ever dared to try to pay for lunch or dinner. You did not mess with the finger. That was it. End of conversation. There was also the voice, as Josh mentioned. One of my favorite memories, I didn't sleep in the loom room, but at the house at Wicklow was waking up early in the morning before anyone else had gotten up and crawling into Grandma and Zadie's bed and singing any number of folk songs from Joshua Giraffe, who lived in a zoo with Buffalo Pooh, to Home on the Range. And of course, what we have now dubbed the silly song, which is what Josh was mentioning, full of obsolete cultural references, but his great-grandkids still sing the song. They know it by heart. I think if I ever have grandkids, they'll be singing it too. And of course, Hai Pata Pata, which for years I thought was gibberish until I saw the play once in New York. And it's a Ukrainian character. And at a completely inappropriate moment, she sings it, and I burst into tears, just completely in awe. It's real. We still sing that every night to our kids, and I think we will for a very, very long time. Sorry. Right. Zadie's voice. And his egalitarian perspective on Judaism, that was really something that left an impression on me. Growing up in kind of a modern Orthodox community, I remember the first time going to Bethel and Zadie putting a kippah on my head. And it was such a strange feeling, but it opened so many doors for me. I was one of the only ones of my friends who had a bat mitzvah myself, as opposed to a class bat mitzvah. It was in a shul, and I remember listening to the cassette tapes that Zadie made for me of my Haftorah portion. They're somewhere buried in our house in Montreal, but if we can find a cassette tape player, I would love to listen to them again. And then there was one of my favorite memories at my Aufruf when Zadie spontaneously read Torah beautifully, the booming voice flawlessly, and I got such credit, such good points with the big macher rabbi of my husband's family, so thank you for that. Zadie also loved to dance, and that's another favorite memory, particularly dancing at my wedding and things like that, but as long as he could, we toe danced, which is when he would put me on his toes and dance me around the kitchen. Another one of my favorite memories that I'd like to share are some of the conversations that we got to have one-on-one, which was a rarity because we always visited as a family, but when Zadie came to New York to visit his dear friend Spider, who lived on Sheridan Square. I never met Spider, but the bonus for me was that we would get to go to the Silver Spur Diner in Greenwich Village and talk. And one of the conversations that I will never forget is when he told me about my grandma and how even if he knew from day one that she would suffer like she did, that they wouldn't be together forever, he would do it over again in a heartbeat. And that was how he felt about his family. And I remember thinking to myself, I was much younger, I was still, just figuring out how to date and things like that, and I thought, that's the benchmark. Try to live up to that. Both of my boys, I think this is, the hardest part, but I feel so lucky that they both got to meet Zadie. My older son, Emmett, is now 5. He will never live down the story of how, when he was about 9 months old, he met Zadie, and it was Zadie's 90th birthday, and his gift to Zadie was to poop on his lap at his 90th birthday party. True story. Nonetheless, he loves his Saba Rabba, and Saba Rabba loved him. He's now starting to learn Hebrew, and he would be so excited to try to call Saba Rabba and say whatever semi-gibberish, semi-Hebrew words he could learn. My younger son, Logan, is just over 2. He only got to meet Zadie once when he was 3 months old, right before COVID. But I will cherish those photos of Zadie holding him and singing to him forever. Even though they didn't really get to know each other, I think Zadie will always have a special relationship with Logan. I've never been able to say this out loud, but when we were naming Logan, even though, in Jewish tradition you don't name after the living, we named Logan after his 3 great-grandmothers, Leo, Lucia, and Lily. But my husband and I talked about this at length, and we didn't want to tell anyone at the time, but he's named after Leon in our hearts. And I can't wait until Logan is old enough to learn about his remarkable grandfather. Brilliant, heroic, kind, loving, a namesake that will be hard to live up to, but if ever there was something worth trying for. There was and will never be anyone quite like my Zadie. I love you. I miss you.
I'd like to thank John and Sarah and Henry and Josh and Gabby for your beautiful, beautiful remarks and painting such a beautiful picture of a man who we all loved and respected so much. It's an honor for me just to say a few words this morning as the rabbi at Bethel, the Heights Synagogue, where Leon Gabinet has been a pillar since the founding of the congregation. I, of course, came into the picture much later, but I could sense from the very beginning that Leon was part of the heart and soul of our shul. He was a regular Torah reader, Haftarah reader, and davener. But more than that, his simple presence brought warmth and humor to our midst. He cared so much for the institution itself, and he also cared for the individuals who make it up. It was so easy to see the affection he shared with others and the ways in which it was returned to him. And it was not just affection, but respect as well. What Leon thought mattered to us. That is why when the synagogue was facing an important ritual decision, I sought out his advice. We met for lunch, and he shared with me some recommendations that in the end were not only helpful, but also gave me a sense that he was a true ally. Whether he was personally in support of the change or not was secondary to his concern about how it would affect our shul as a whole, and certain individuals in particular. There are a few memories of Leon over the last few years that stand out for me. There's the way that each Shabbat morning, he and Henry would be waiting downstairs for me so that when I arrived, we could sing Kiddush together and harmonize the very last words of Vishamru, Lidorotam Berit Olam. There was also the pre-pandemic Friday night dinner at my home with Louise and Henry and Marilyn. What a fun and funny night that was, with plenty of surprising and entertaining stories. And of course, I will always miss the way that he called me Rebbe. Over the last couple of months while Leon was in hospice care, I was able to visit him a couple of times each week. Over that time, communication became more and more difficult, but I made a point every Friday afternoon to pray the Kabbalat Shabbat service with him. Even when Leon was barely able to speak, he would mouth the words along with certain prayers or psalms. It amazed and frankly comforted me to see how deeply ingrained the words and melodies were. This last Friday was the first time when he did not sing along, and I could sense that it might be his last Shabbat with us. And now, Shabbat at our shul will never again be the same. Leon, as you may know, passed away on the last day of Hanukkah. This holiday is a celebration of the rededication of the temple in Jerusalem after it was defiled by the Greeks. The word Chanukah means dedication. And certainly Leon was a dedicated son, husband, father, grandfather, great-grandfather, brother, and friend. He was dedicated to the law and to teaching it. He was dedicated to this country, to Israel, and to the Jewish community. And so in the coming days and months of mourning, we must dedicate ourselves to the task of carrying on the ideals and causes that were important to Leon. In this way, we can help to ensure that his memory will burn bright, just like the fully lit menorah on the 8th day of Hanukkah. Yehei Zichrono Baruch, may the memory of Leon Gabinet always be a blessing. On behalf of everyone at Bethel, the Heights Synagogue, and everyone in the community, we extend our deepest condolences to Leon's children, to Sarah and John, to Katie and Ira, and Ari and Chris, to grandchildren Josh and Danielle, Gavi and Daniel, Nathan and Melissa, Nicholas and Benjamin, to great-grandchildren Nora, Emmett, Logan, Samson, and Lily, and to his companion and dear friend and love, Louise, to nieces and nephew, and family and friends. We wish you Hamakom Yenachem Etchem Betok Shar Avilei Tzion Yerushalayim. May you be comforted together with all others among the people Israel who are in mourning. And we say, Amen. To bring the service here at the chapel to a close, we recite the El Malei Rachamim memorial prayer. We ask those who are able to please rise. El Malei Rachamim Shochein Bamromim Hamsei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Ashchina B'malot Kidoshim Otorim K'zorakia Mazhirim Et Nishmat Eliezer ben Chaim V'Sara Shehalach Le'olamo Began Eden Tehei Menuchato Ana Bal HaRachamim Hastireu B'Seter Kenafecha Le'olamim Utzror B'Tzror HaChayim Et Nishmato Adonai Hu Nachalato V'yanuach b'shalom al mishkavo, v'nomar, Amen. O God, exalted and full of compassion, grant perfect peace in your sheltering presence among the holy and pure, to the soul of Leon Gabinet Eliezer ben Chaim V'Sara, who has gone to his eternal home. Master of mercy, we beseech you, remember all the worthy deeds that he performed in the land of the living. May his soul be bound up in the bond of life. The Lord is his portion. May he rest in peace. And let us say, Amen. You can be seated. Conclude the service with the bringing of the casket out to the vehicle. So we'll call on the folks from the Memorial Chapel. And those who are able, rise.